All right, yeah. So I work on the Gatsby core team full time. I help maintain it, help build new features. And today I want to talk a little bit about how we can scale the web with Gatsby. So let's take a history lesson. Early websites were just plain HTML, right? Back in I think the 70s or the 80s, you had servers serving flat files that had HTML in them, and if you had to visit a URL, you just see that plain HTML. Then came servers and CGI scripts. Remember those? You could write arbitrary scripts that would serve pages that were built on the fly, and that's where server-side rendering began. And then we've had Rails, we've had Django, now we've had Node, with large sites like Spectrum, for example, that my colleague built, Max. Um, Most of these sites today are served off of a server-side rendering framework. Next is a great example of this, right? And we've seen this, and interestingly enough, lately, we've seen what's become popularly known as the Jamstack, right? And it almost feels like we've come full circle because we started with static files, and that's what the Jamstack is about as well. That your site is just a bunch of static files that's deployed to a CDN somewhere. And the Netlify team came up with the term Jamstack. And besides what that stands for and what that means, the idea here is that static websites have had this huge resurgence in popularity, primarily because of a multiple set of reasons that they're simple, they're cheaper. So let's look at those reasons. Let's see why they've become popular again. Um, all of these, in case you haven't used these, in case you haven't known before, all static site generators work under the principle that at compile time, at build time, they take your pages, they take your data, they construct all your HTML, all your CSS, all your JavaScript, and let you serve those flat files off of a CDN. Hugo does this, Jekyll does this, Eleventy does this, Gatsby that we work on also does this, and Gatsby did indeed start off as a static site generator, as something that would take your data, take your pages, and give you a bunch of assets, right? Um, but what does Gatsby actually do? Let's dive a little deeper into what Gatsby does and what we're looking forward to. You typically have, if you haven't used Gatsby before, Gatsby uses React under the hood. So you can write React components for your pages. You can use GraphQL to fetch data. GraphQL is great. The beauty of GraphQL here is that it lets you fetch data from multiple different sources. Gatsby has a lot of different source plugins. You can get data from effectively any CMS. And what Gatsby does is it takes these React components and takes this data from your GraphQL queries, compiles them together, and gives you a bunch of files. And you can serve them on the CDN, right? And what that looks like in terms of code is something like this. You write a component that returns some text saying hello from author, right? You write a query that gets author from some collection somewhere in GraphQL. And Gatsby effectively builds these out of it, which is an HTML file with hello from Sid, because the name of the author was Sid, and a JSON file with your data, right? And you serve that off of a CDN like we've seen. However, what does this tell us? Why is this good? This is good because like Max Lynch recently tweeted, and I saw this a couple of days ago, static sites are great because, I mean, the number one thing that comes to mind is you don't even need really fast, expensive servers to serve these sites, right? Your server bill is not going to sort of be a function of how much traffic you're getting. And let's look at these reasons in depth. The first one, like I just touched, is simplicity. You're not running servers. You're not maintaining long running processes on boxes on AWS, and you don't have to maintain. You don't have to make sure your database is up. And all of this is good because as a developer, you're dealing with a lot less runtime complexity. You're not dealing with stuff that has to be up and alive while your site is alive. Besides simplicity, like I just said, it's also really cheap. Like Max said, um, running servers and databases for sites that get a lot of traffic is really expensive. And you're talking about an AWS bill of a couple of thousands of dollars, which dramatically comes down when you look at static sites and you host something like this on S3, Netlify or Fastly. Typically, I mean, it's almost free to host these sites. Then the security, right? Security is hard. We've all been there. I mean, I still remember having a MongoDB collection at some point with its port open, and I remember my entire collection got wiped out, and someone left a record in there saying that, hey, send us Bitcoin to this address to get your data back. And the funny thing is that wasn't even a person, that was just a script, right? And security is hard. What I think the point here is that it's really hard to make sure all of your services and all of your databases are up and are secure from malicious users, right? And this also makes your stack a lot more complicated, because then you're looking at VPNs, you're looking at end-to-end encryption. With static sites, you don't need any of this, because none of these databases or services need to actually be accessible to the public internet. Finally, the stability. Recently, a couple of months ago, the Gatsby team, we had, I think someone accidentally, we deleted a contentful instance. Contentful is a CMS that we use for gatsbyjs.com. And we accidentally deleted the CMS. And guess what? Nothing happened. I mean, the site was up the entire time. And that's the thing about static sites. They don't need access to these services at runtime. If this happened with a site that hit the API, like a server-side rendered site, the site would most definitely go down if contentful was, if your instance was deleted. But nothing happened. I mean, we reached out to the wonderful folks at Contentful. They got our instance back up, and a day later, things were, the site never went down. Nobody knew about it. And just to recap, these are reasons why, and these are well-known reasons. These are reasons why people like static sites, why people like the Jamstack, right? But there are limitations to this. And typically these reservations, they circle around two big things. One is either you feel like your site is too big for the Jamstack, or it updates too quickly, right? Let's talk about each of these. With a site that's too big, you might think maybe 100,000 pages, 200,000 pages. You have a lot of products that you're displaying on your e-commerce site. The larger your page is, typically that's the amount of time your site takes to build is a function of that. And builds have traditionally always been ON, right? Where N is the number of pages. You've always had builds take linearly more time as you have more pages. And when I mean builds for any static site generator, right? Gatsby has also suffered from this for a while, where the moment your site starts growing really large, and we've seen this with even blogs, with people who have thousands of blog posts, over time the site takes longer and longer to build. And that's one of the reasons why people typically shy away from Jamstack sites or static sites when it comes to a website that is massive. And every single time you make a change to any page, your site needs to be rebuilt, and that's why it's ON. However, we fixed this. We changed this with incremental builds. If you haven't recently, if you haven't heard, or if, in case you missed it, we have a service called Gatsby Cloud, which is a build service for your Gatsby sites. And we recently launched incremental builds on Gatsby Cloud. And the entire idea of incremental builds was that instead of ON, builds are now O1, right? If you make a change to one single page, that's the only page that gets rebuilt. Well, more accurately speaking, I mean, if you made changes to M number of pages, like 4 or 5, only 4 or 5 pages would change instead of your entire site. This solves our problem where, your site might be too big. And now that we know that, before we jump into a demo, let's take a look at how this works under the hood, right? With Gatsby, your site is a function of code and data, right? You can have two things that come into a site, like we saw previously. You can have React code, you can have data from CMS, and your website is a function of these. Now, React taught us something really, really powerful. Retaught us something really powerful a couple of years ago, which is that your view is a function of your data. Now, similarly, something that we realized a couple of months ago was that every website is a function of code and data at one point in time, and derived data sort of has to track changes to its sources. But this has been a problem that's been solved multiple times in the past. This has been a very common problem to many different fields in computer science. So, like I said, Gatsby takes your code and data, builds a website. We've seen different approaches to solving this problem in the past, right? Back in the 60s and the 70s, we had batch processing where machines weren't fast enough to be able to do this real time. So they'd have to take up batches and build things. And that was one approach. Then we did stuff that's on demand. Now, this is similar to how we do websites with server-side frameworks today. You have multiple servers running, pages are generated on demand, and that can get expensive really quickly. And it's also, besides expensive, and expensive, when I say expensive, I mean expensive in terms of cost, but there's also the matter of complexity with respect to caching. I mean, we've all heard the phrase that caching and cache invalidation is one of the hardest problems in computer science. And it's true, because caches grow large over time. It's hard to maintain them. It's hard to invalidate them. Anytime a change happens to your site, it's really tricky to go back and ensure that your cache is up to date. We've all seen these problems before. They're not easy to fix. So that's the on-demand approach. And then there's the approach that has to do with materialized views. This is a term that comes from the database world, but what a materialized view effectively means is that it's just a different view of your data. And if you think about it, that's what a website really is, isn't it? I mean, it's a view of several different pieces of data, but a view specific to a browser, right? And this is better than stuff that's on demand, primarily because instead of pull based, where you have a request coming in for a page and that being built on demand, this is push based. Every time a change happens, you can easily reason and sort of deterministically make that patch atomically to your set of assets, right? And this is, if we were to look at what materialized views really are, and in our analogy of Gatsby and static sites versus sites that are rendered by server-side frameworks, you quickly see that Gatsby is closer to sort of the analogy in terms of it being a pure function of your code and data, whereas SSR is not. And your website is, again, just a materialized view. So how does this concept, how do we take this and where do we go with it is the question. With incremental builds in Gatsby Cloud, what we've built is we've effectively built a stream processor. We're looking at an evented system which gets events. Now, events can be pushes to Git, where you make changes in your code, or it could be changes in data from your CMS. And every time you trigger any event, which is either a code change or a data change, that internally is reconciled, and Gatsby figures out what in your assets needs to change. This is actually really similar to how React reconciliation works as well. But instead of the virtual DOM, we have a data structure in memory where we map out dependencies and ensure that things are updated as your data changes. And the way this looks internally is that you can have mutations coming from data sources. A mutation is any kind of change. An example would be a change in a title or a change in the description of a page. And Gatsby maintains this internal store, like I just mentioned, which we call the node store. And that store is the store of all of your data. Now, the reconciliation that Gatsby does is that every time there's a mutation or a change in that data, Gatsby goes back, finds queries in your site that consume that data, then finds pages that consume those queries, and then makes those changes and uploads those changes. You can see how these are atomic patches to the state, which is your website, which is just a bunch of static files, right? But where this gets interesting in a stream processor is that your framework isn't your static framework. Your your static site generator and more framework isn't static anymore. It's a pipeline. Changes can happen as, in continuum. They don't have to sort of be limited, and they don't have to happen one at a time. Different changes can happen at the same time, and your stream processor would process all of these and handle reconciliation. That's what Gatsby Cloud looks like today. Let's take a look at a quick demo of how this works, because we've spoken about incremental builds, but in case you haven't seen this and seen how this works, practically, it might be hard to appreciate this. I have a Gatsby site up and running here. There you go. So this is a site. This is Gatsby Cloud, in case you haven't seen Gatsby Cloud before. And this is a site that is built off of a starter using a CMS called Dado CMS. Really nice CMS. Check it out. And the starter has a bunch of different pages, as you can see. There's an about page where the title is Sid 4000. If I and you can look at a couple of historical builds and how long they take. But let's trigger a new build. Let's go to our CMS and change this to what's up, React Europe. All right, and let's hit save. Now, while this change happens, let's take a look at our dashboard in Gatsby Cloud. We can see that a new build was queued. In the stream processor that is Gatsby Cloud, this is the mutation in data that I was referring to. Now you can see that while I was talking, we're already done building and deploying to Netlify. And the entire thing took 5 + 2, 7 seconds to build, right? It probably took longer for those logs to load than for the entire build to happen. And you can see, as I was previously speaking, about how this fetches the data, rebuilds schema, processes some queries, uploads. This is what incremental builds looks like today, right? You make a change in a CMS. The CMS tells Gatsby Cloud about that change. The stream processor in Gatsby Cloud detects what data has changed, tracks those queries, reruns them, rebuilds pages. We also do a bunch of smart diffing around what to upload to our CDN. As you can see, uploading just took 2 seconds to Netlify. And the reason it took 2 seconds is because we incrementally uploaded only the files that changed, which is, I think, one HTML file and one page data file in this case. Now, let's take a look at, so yeah, this is a screenshot of the same thing where it took 1 second to deploy, it took 6 seconds to build. And that's a 10-second build. That's incremental builds today in production on Gatsby Cloud with multiple different CMSs. That's how incremental builds works today and looks like today. But, and yeah, before we get to what I was getting to, like I said, there's multiple different CMSs you can use. You can use Contentful, Sanity, Agility CMS, Datto. We're also building in support for WordPress and Drupal coming soon. Any source plugin that any CMS that has a source plugin for Gatsby should just work. We're yet to write out guidelines on how to make your plugin work best with incremental builds, but all of that is coming soon. So yeah, with this, we've solved the problem of my site being too big, right? We were talking about 2 different problems that we had, 2 different limitations on why we wouldn't build a site with Gatsby. One of them was that your site's too big. The other one was that your site has changes that happen too quickly. We've seen that with incremental builds, we've solved the first problem. Let's talk about the second one. So if you've been following closely, you're probably seeing where I'm going with this and where the stream processor analogy is headed. If your site updates too quickly, let's say you're building something like a Bitcoin tracking site, like a price tracking site, all right, or a news site with headlines or with breaking news that render right at the top. We've actually had people building sites with Gatsby, sites like these, and what we learned is that in many cases, a lot of one of the biggest reasons why people felt like Gatsby might not have been the right tool for the job, or why they needed, a dynamic sort of SSR setup, was because they'd have updates that came in too quickly. However, why is this a problem? And let's look at if we can solve it with Gatsby. What if you have a site like Spectrum? Max, who now works with us at Gatsby, built Spectrum, and it's both really large and both also changes pretty often because people leave comments, and each of those comments effectively changes your pages, right? Let's take a look at a quick demo of something that aims to solve this. This is not in production right now. This is currently running on my local machine, but let me show you what it looks like. So I have this site here called Every Second, which was courtesy of Kyle. And what this site does is that this site basically simulates a data source that would change every second. If you've seen Gatsby code before, you've probably seen this Gatsby node file. What this is doing is that every plugin in Gatsby has a Gatsby node file, which lets it source data. And when you source data, you probably remember that I called something a node store earlier. The node store is our store of data, and we call our data nodes. And you can see that what this plugin does is that it creates those nodes. So it creates data that the site can consume. Now, what's interesting about this specific site, like I said, is that it simulates a really fast churning, like a site with a lot of data that gets created really, really quickly. The way it does that is actually really simple. It just has a set interval, and this set interval gets called every second. And after every second, it goes and calls this function called create node shop, which effectively creates a node with my cool date in it, with a type called the time, which is kudos to Kyle for great naming here. But so yeah, what this is doing is this is effectively similar to, say, any website that would have an update every second. Now, can you build a static site that updates every second? We've seen that we can rebuild sites in under 10 seconds, but what about sites that need to update even faster than 10 seconds? Let's take a look at what we have with this today. I have this local thing running. This thing is a bunch of services that are usually deployed on Gatsby Cloud, and you can see a lot of logs. But I have the site being, where is my site? I have my site. Oh, there you go. So I have my site being served at localhost 8,000. And you can take a look at what this is doing. What the site is doing is that it's rendering the time at when that data was updated. And you can see that I'm getting changes to my client practically every second, right? Now, what you're seeing here are not changes over, like client-side stuff over JavaScript. If I were to refresh this page, I would, okay, there you go. That doesn't work. Like every demo ever. There you go. Sorry, I needed a forward slash. But if you refresh this page with a forward slash, you'll see that I still get the most recently built time. So this isn't happening on the client at runtime. What's happening is that your page is being built every 2 or 3 seconds in this case, as you can see. These logs aren't exactly very readable because a lot of stuff is happening really fast. But what it's basically doing is that it's getting mutations in a stream, processing those mutations, figuring out what queries use them, what pages use them, and rendering those pages in time. And this is obviously work in progress. We're yet to get this on Gatsby Cloud and have it working at scale. But once it does, what you previously saw as a 10-second build is gonna be a lot faster than 10 seconds. We're looking at sub 1 second builds coming in some point this year, right? And with something like that, this is the kind of site that you couldn't previously build with Gatsby, but now you can. So your limitation about your site updating too quickly is not going to be a limitation really soon. And we're calling this streaming builds. I don't know how we came up with this name, but I think the idea is that we have a stream processor, we have events that are being streamed in, and we're effectively streaming assets for your website to your CDN, right? And this, like I said previously, is a continuous process as opposed to something that happens um, how do I put this? As opposed to something that happens every once in a while, this is more of a continuous process that is streamed. So all of your changes are streamed to your assets on your CDN, which is why we're calling it streaming builds. Fun name. Reach out to me on Twitter to learn more about what this actually means. And I guess the conclusion here is that your build pipeline doesn't have to be static anymore. Your build pipeline can be as dynamic as your site needs to be. And this can work with any data sources at any scale with Gatsby. And remember, you don't have to worry about any of this complexity yourself as a developer. I mean, the fact that all of this is happening in the background is all implementation details. You can just build your site, update data as quickly as you want, get all those advantages that you get with static sites, but now break limitations that previously people have seen. Max and I were talking about this, and Max had this really fun thing to say about the fact that if build and deployment of your content is really that fast, then in theory, he could have built Spectrum with an architecture like this, and it would have been a lot more stable, a lot more performant, a lot more scalable, a lot more cheaper as well to host. He wouldn't have needed as many, say, node processes to run to host this entire site. If it were built in an architecture like this. And we're really excited to see where people go with this and the kind of stuff that they built once this is publicly available. Besides that, I also wanted to quickly share lots of different things that we're doing this year. A couple of these things are already shipped. We now have native TypeScript support in Gatsby. You can create a .ts file and just start writing TypeScript and it'll just work. There is some nuance here. It doesn't work in Gatsby config and Gatsby node, but that's coming soon too. But native TypeScript support is really important to us to get done this year, and that's something that's on the roadmap. We've also pretty much rewritten most of Gatsby in TypeScript as well, which has helped us, catch a lot of bugs, and it's great. So we love TypeScript. Streaming builds on Gatsby Cloud is what I meant to write there. Streaming builds is coming sometime this year. Incremental code changes is coming as well. Right now, we only support data changes for this stream processor that I've been talking about, but code changes will come soon as well. And with code changes, think of the entire same setup, but with your assets only being patched with changes in your code. We're building something that we're calling unified routing, which is simpler APIs, easier APIs for people to build collections of pages and for pagination. We're building in modern builds where you'd be able to build multiple builds of your Gatsby site for modern browsers and for old browsers. Earlier last year, we did distributed builds on Gatsby Cloud for images, where images started getting, you've seen that Gatsby Cloud is faster than any other build service today for Gatsby sites because it can parallelize image generation. We're doing this later this year for HTML as well. And soon you're going to see sites with millions of pages being built really, really quickly under minutes because of distributed I/O. Fast refresh, we've already supported this for a while now, just like Next, which is great. Kudos to their team. We support this under a flag right now because of backwards compatibility, because fast refresh is only supported by newer versions of React, and Gatsby supports versions of React all the way pre-hooks and pre, when we have class components. We have an effort on first-class internationalization. We're also working on something we're calling Gatsby Admin, which is going to be a front end to Gatsby to let you add plugins and do more. So there's a lot coming this year. You can obviously check it out on both these URLs. GatsbyJS.com is where you want to go if you want to check out Gatsby Cloud and everything that I've been talking about, the really fast builds. GatsbyJS.org is the open source docs. If you want to learn Gatsby, if you haven't used Gatsby before, that's where you want to go. A big thank you to all of my colleagues and Kyle, Matt, Abhi, Mihail, Ward, and Mihail specifically. All of these people did some incredible work on incremental builds. And yeah, that was me. That's my talk.
One thing I noticed about your slides at the end was first-class internationalization support, being a pretty global crowd here. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, what it looks like at a high level?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I think so. Tim mentioned this earlier as well. Internationalization is really hard to get right, and we haven't seen a lot of frameworks actually do that yet. We've been talking to people who've built multilingual Gatsby sites in the past, and currently the way we intend to implement this is with a couple of Gatsby themes that support internationalization for different varying data sources. We haven't really figured out the exact. I mean, we haven't really figured out what the API is going to look like yet, because, like I said, it's a hard problem. But the aim is to make internationalization first class in Gatsby, where you won't have to necessarily install a plugin, or you won't have to, you know, bring your own batteries, where things come included in the framework. So yeah, there's we don't have uh, we don't have a very clear idea of what it's going to look like, but we are working on it sometime this year.
I think it's very interesting. First of all, great talk, and obviously amazing work by the team. I think it's really interesting how we're kind of like um, we're it's like we're merging this paradigm of like a static site and a running server, and then we're just kind of blending this paradigm. Like Michael Jackson from the React Router team. There's been a couple new like React meta frameworks that have come out, right? And Michael Jackson has always been on the side of, hey, we could just have a running server and then cache it on the CDN. And like this streaming build concept, it's a little bit like that, like, except that like the data source comes from inside the system rather than from outside. I don't know, like what do you think of this whole like blending of client and blending of static and the running server paradigm?
Yeah, that's a great question, Sean. Thank you. I was actually talking to Kyle about this yesterday, about how sometimes it feels like a lot of this is really, really similar to just having a server running behind a CDN. But right, that's what Michael Jackson's also said on Twitter. But where these sort of differentiate from each other, and something that I was talking about in my talk, is that this is a lot more deterministic and easier to reason with, and primarily because it's push based, right? Like you said, an event occurs because some data changes, and we're able to deterministically push an atomic patch to the state of the world, that state of the world being your assets on your CDN. With a server running behind a CDN, it's pull based. You have to make a request. Someone needs to make a request for that first sort of cache invalidation to happen. It's not really easy to reason with. Different users from different edges might see different things. It's typically a lot harder to reason about at scale. And we've all seen how hard cache invalidation can get. With this model, what we think sort of what we think differentiates it from that model is simplicity. A, your state is always a pure function of your data. The state on the CDN is always up to date. You can time travel at any point in time and look at what that state looked like at previous different points in time. And it's really easy to reason about. Plus, the developer doesn't have to worry about it at all. For a developer building a Gatsby site, they don't need to know about servers. They don't need to worry about long running processes or any state that they need to maintain. They just need to build a site the way they already do, and all of this happens under the hood. So yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah. I think we just need to be very clear. I think we maybe don't have the right terminology to discuss this yet. So
Yeah.
the more we discuss this, yeah.
So we have a few more questions
so
coming into the chat on Discord. This one's a little bit interesting question. And I'm going to phrase it a little bit differently, but they said that they feel that Gatsby and Next are overlapping a little bit more and more as we move along. So his question was, what are your thoughts on this? And my question is more, what may differentiate Gatsby from Next.js? And it's not to say anything bad about one or the other. I've used both and they're both amazing, but I just wanted to hear from you kind of what you think differentiates one from the other.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something we get quite often on Twitter and social media, etc. So yes, we're both it looks like we're both converging towards a static future. Tim spoke a lot about this in his talk as well, where Next now lets you build some pages statically, lets you have dynamic routes as well. I think that there's enough space for both of these tools to coexist. And I think it boils down to the right flavor of abstraction. They both let you do really similar things, but Gatsby is a lot more batteries included, where you have plugins to source your data. With Next, typically you're writing your own database queries, you're writing code imperatively that will fetch your data for your pages. With Gatsby, typically all of this is done for you in source plugins and is all available over GraphQL. So I think it boils down to more of a flavor of abstraction that people prefer. Some people prefer really slim, minimal frameworks like Next. I love them. Some people some people prefer stuff that comes with more batteries included. But yeah, in terms of the problems we're solving, we're both tools to build websites with. And we both, I think, agree that static is definitely the future. And we've sort of come full circle that way.
It's an interesting answer. It almost could be used for like the difference between React and Angular. Same kind of answer, right? Again, more thanks for the talk from the chat. All these features are awesome. Will streaming builds and incremental builds be available for people using services besides Gatsby Cloud?
Excellent question. Short answer, no. Long answer, it's a little more nuanced than that. So with a lot of the stuff that I was talking about, like the stream processor and the fact that we use distributed workers to make your builds faster, a lot of this is tied really deeply into cloud infrastructure. Most other services aren't built just for Gatsby. Gatsby Cloud is, which is why we're able to design stuff around Gatsby, which is why a lot of the stuff is really hard to do on other platforms. However, even though you won't get streaming builds or incremental builds on, say, Netlify or Zeit or Vercel now, what you will get is the numerous other improvements that we're doing along the way. To make incremental builds possible, we've patched plugins from Datto CMS, for example, and we've done a lot of upstream open source work to make the entire ecosystem really fast and a lot less brittle. So all of that is still going to come. So needless to say, even if you aren't building your site on Gatsby Cloud, builds in general are going to get a lot faster on every platform. And you've seen this with Netlify as well. You've seen Jason's post. Builds in general are getting much faster everywhere, but Gatsby Cloud is where they'll likely be the fastest because we've designed the entire platform around Gatsby.
That's interesting to note. Another question, I'm trying to think of how to word this correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Will the Gatsby I-18 support, I-18N internationalization support be used for the internationalization of Gatsby documentation?
Excellent question. So one of the things that we have someone on our team. Her name is Nat. Nat is currently helping. So she helped the React team do internationalization. She's working with us as well. And a big part of what I previously mentioned with respect to us trying to sort of figure out what the right abstractions here are is to finish internationalizing and translating gatsbyjs.org itself, and then take those learnings and build in these APIs. That's currently an ongoing effort. There's been a lot of contribution from a lot of different people. We currently have translations in upwards of 10 or 15 languages, if I recall. It's not live on the production site yet. A lot of that is still work in progress. But ideally, yes, we will switch Gatsby.js over to those APIs that we release once they're sort of cemented in and once they're, APIs that we publicly release.
Yes. Another question, how does streaming build affect build costs? I think you touched on this a little bit inside of the talk, but again, how does streaming build affect your build costs?
That's a great question. Pricing is tricky, right? And I won't go too deep into how we price stuff on Gatsby Cloud, because streaming builds is definitely in the future and we haven't really figured it out yet, to be honest. One thing I can tell you is that it's going to be significantly cheaper than running your own servers nonetheless, because, well, even for us, in terms of cost of infrastructure, we're not talking about long-running processes that need to be up and alive. We're talking about workers that are able to make atomic patches to otherwise just static files. lying on cloud storage. So there's definitely a downward trajectory in terms of cost. In terms of how much this will cost in reality on Gatsby Cloud once we launch it, I think that's a question that we don't have the answer to yet. Probably will in the future.
That's expected. One other note that you said that Nat is working on the internationalization of the documentation with you guys. There actually is a really good talk that she did, and it's on YouTube somewhere, about how she actually, all the trials and tribulations of doing that for the React.js team, and just thought I'd note, check that out. It's a really good one.
Yeah, for sure.
I think it's React Conf last year.
React Rally, I think it is.
Yeah.
Rally?
Yeah.
Sorry.
I think it was Rally, which is exactly why it's great
Come
to
on,
have
man.
her. It's great to have her help us with this, because I mean, she's already done it, and we both, I mean, we all know how hard and tricky internationalization can get. So
yes,
sure.
Absolutely. Great talk. How about you, Sean? Do you have any other questions? Because I know that you're a big time Gatsby user, or at least that you've used it a lot. Do you have any specific questions for him?
No, like I haven't actually used Gatsby in a while, but recipe seems like the newest thing that I think you maybe didn't cover in your talk, Sid, but it seemed like a big deal. I thought it was just like fancy instructions, but actually it's code mods. I don't know if you want to talk about how that's been going.
Yeah, for sure. So recipes is super interesting, because I think it can be relevant for stuff beyond Gatsby. What recipes is effectively is, like you said, a bunch of code mods that let you automatically, add stuff to config, install npm dependencies, and you can write them as MDX, so they can serve as both as documentation as well as code that Gatsby can run as a recipe. I mentioned Gatsby admin earlier. One of the reasons we're building Gatsby recipes is so that Gatsby admin can have recipes that you can just sort of click on and add plugins with. So that's sort of part of that effort. That's where that's headed.
Yeah, sounds exciting. Like, Gatsby was always, when I first encountered it, it was always meant to be the WordPress killer. And, every WordPress killer needs an admin panel.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and I know that we definitely, everyone here supports both Gatsby and Next.js. One of the things that I can just tell other people out there who haven't touched either of these frameworks is that if you're new to React or you're new to GraphQL, that just getting involved with building a blog with Gatsby is a really great way to learn more about React, to see how an interesting framework like this puts all the pieces together behind the scene. I've seen some people that are actually going to be speaking today do amazing workshops where they use either Gatsby or Next to just build these awesome experiences where you can try out GraphQL and all these other things. So just a kind of a nudge to get people using these frameworks out there, because just after a couple days using Gatsby to set up my blog, I felt a lot more empowered. And I also was finding out all these new ways that I could use React and GraphQL. So I was wondering if you had any additional comments on that, or?
Yeah, I think it's great. One of the things that I love about what the Next team is doing, for instance, that Tim mentioned, is that they went ahead and got support for React Refresh in before even Create React App is added, for instance. We added support for React Refresh earlier in with a flag as well, like you saw. And stuff like this is really cool, because it lets you sort of get so many of these benefits for free. As a React developer, I don't have to worry about how hot reloading would work under the hood. I can just upgrade Gatsby or upgrade Next and get it for free. So I think where frameworks like Gatsby and Next really shine is that they let you just get a lot more productive to build your site. You're not worrying about Webpack configs anymore. You don't have to set up TypeScript; it just works. You don't need to worry about how hot reloading would work under the hood. Style components just works. A lot of these things that we otherwise know can be really tricky, and that people have gotten really sort of fatigued by the setup. A lot of that you just now get for free, and I think that's what the real power is of frameworks like Gatsby and Next.
I can attest that working for a company who has documentation, sometimes done in other frameworks or other build systems, that it can be very hard to contribute to those things or contribute to a blog or something like that. So if you build a project with Gatsby, the ease of someone to get in and kind of contribute to your blog or contribute to documentation is just all of a sudden very easily. They're copying an MDX file or an ASCII doc file or something, and just copying it into a new folder and doing a pull request, and boom, you have a new page or a new documentation page or a new blog up very easily. So yeah, and then also with the integration with things like Netlify, where these things build automatically from a certain branch through GitHub. I mean, it's just all amazing technology, and I think we thank you guys for doing excellent work.
I have a question.
Thank you so much.
So we're using Gatsby on the regular website, and so we have lots of speaker pictures, and they come from our CMS. So every time we rebuild the site, it re-downloads all the images, even those that don't change. It doesn't resize them if they haven't changed, but still it re-downloads them every single time. Is there a way to avoid this, like sending
that's
a header or something? Or
that's a great question. So short answer, depends on your CMS, because the Gatsby source plugin for every CMS is implemented differently, and it would ideally, if your plugin caches them locally correctly using our APIs, this wouldn't happen. In reality, I think it boils down to the fact that we need better APIs that do more of these things under the hood for plugin authors, so that plugins are more stable. We are working on better APIs for caching and for selective cache invalidation, which will improve this for the ecosystem as a whole. But talking about your specific plugin, I mean, if you can tell me what the source plugin is or what the CMS is, I can definitely take a look. Oh, it's a custom server. Okay, so you probably need to make sure you use create remote file node when you download those images, and that will cache it indefinitely. Also, you need to send e-tags from your server to make sure that it can sort of fetch and invalidate and make sure nothing's changed. But yeah, we probably need better docs on this. We need better low level APIs. Like I said, we're definitely working on building up the ecosystem as a whole.
The e-tag should be on the address of the images of the image itself.
Yes. You should have e-tags on those on the URLs for the images coming down from the server, and your source plugin should be able to check the e-tag versus the last one that it downloaded and it fetched to make sure that it doesn't sort of do that work again, because you can typically just send a head request and get that back.
Would there be a way to include the e-tag in the GraphQL endpoint for each image? Does it make sense? Like an updated
ideally no, because
a timestamp?
Ideally, probably not, because this is still implementation specific. I mean, your front end React code that writes GraphQL, where you write GraphQL queries to fetch these, shouldn't have to worry about whether the image is cached or not. That should likely be the job of the source plugin. So I wouldn't expose them to GraphQL. I would just write a plugin in a way that it just works. So we should probably just update or fix the plugin that you're using. Okay.
Is there some documentation about this?
Not a lot. I wish there was, but not a lot about this specific topic. But yeah, I'll open up an issue and I'll direct this to the right team and get us thinking about this more.
Yeah, and you can check out Siddhartha over on Twitter at Chat Siddhartha. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah. That is
so.
Correct.
Just Chat and then his first name. Is there anything else you wanted to add before we take a break?
Thank you for having me. Check out Gatsby Cloud. If you have any other questions, please feel free to tweet at me on Twitter, and I'll be happy to take those. And thank you so much for all your work on the conference. This is great. Even though we're all in lockdown, it's nice to be able to talk to each other.
Oh, by the way, where are you joining us from today?
Bombay, India.
Okay. Well, you're a little bit ahead of all of us, so
yep.
I guess have a good morning soon.
No, it's about 5 p.m. right now. So yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, then have a good evening.
Yep.
I'm the furthest out, but yeah. All right. See you guys.